Nurse Linda had seen plenty of strange things in her years at Steer House Nursing Home. Patients who suddenly became lucid right before they passed. Others who swore they saw their loved ones waiting for them. But nothing compared to Oscar. She still remembers the first time she noticed something was different about him. It was a quiet afternoon and she was finishing up her rounds when she saw Oscar jump onto the bed of Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman in the late stages of dementia. He curled up beside her, pressing himself against her frail body. Linda smiled at first. "Looks like you've got a new friend, Mrs. Callahan," she whispered. But then, just a few hours later, Mrs. Callahan took her last breath. Oscar stayed until the nurses came to check on her. Only then did he stand, stretch, and silently leave the room. Linda tried to shake it off. Just a coincidence. Until it happened again. And again. And again. Every time Oscar chose a patient, they passed away within hours. Oscar wasn't just a therapy cat. Some believed he was a guardian. Others whispered he was a warning. But one thing was certain. When he chose you, time was already running out. At first, the staff tried to explain it away. Coincidence, they told themselves, a fluke. But as the pattern continued, denial became harder to cling to. One nurse suggested maybe he just likes warm places. Or maybe he can sense something we can't, Linda murmured. No one wanted to say it out loud, but deep down, they knew. Oscar wasn't picking patients at random. One day, he walked into Mr. Jenkins' room, a retired school principal, battling late-stage heart failure. Linda stood outside, watching. Jenkins had been stable that morning, even cracking a joke with the staff. There was no reason to believe he was in his final hours. But Oscar jumped onto his bed, curled up at his feet, and let out a slow, heavy sigh. Linda's stomach twisted and she exhaled sharply. "Call his family." Another nurse responded. "But his vitals are still stable." Linda, with more confidence this time, said, "I know, but call them." Mr. Jenkins died that evening. From that moment on, no one questioned Oscar's gift. When he picked a patient, the staff no longer relied on machines or medical charts. They relied on him. After the 10th, 20th, 50th time, it was impossible to ignore. The staff began tracking his movements. Oscar never picked the wrong patient. And when he did pick someone, the nurses made a call. "You should come now," they would tell the family. "It's time." Some relatives didn't believe it. How could a cat know what even doctors couldn't predict? But when they arrived, Oscar was already there, curled up beside their loved one, waiting. And within hours, sometimes minutes, they were gone. Oscar's reputation spread beyond Steer House. He was called the Cat of Death in newspapers. Scientists wanted to study him. Some people were amazed. Others were terrified, but those who worked at Steer House didn't question it anymore. Oscar wasn't there to harm. He was there to make sure no one left this world alone. The story reached the media. Scientists and doctors wanted answers. Was Oscar smelling changes in body chemistry? Could he sense tiny shifts in body temperature or the release of a final breath? Was it instinct or something more? Linda tried to rationalize it. Maybe he detects pheromones the body releases before death, but even she wasn't sure, because sometimes Oscar did things science couldn't explain. One night, a patient named Mr. Langley had been placed on hospice care. The nurses expected him to pass soon. Oscar walked in, paused, and then turned away. Instead, he padded down the hall to another room, where a woman named Alice, who had seemed stable, was resting. Oscar jumped onto her bed. The staff hesitated. A young nurse whispered, "Are you sure it's not a mistake?" Linda just shook her head as she said, "No, it's not a mistake." Alice passed away before sunrise, while Mr. Langley lived another 2 days. When he passed, Oscar was right by his side. As time passed, the nurses stopped questioning Oscar's behavior. Instead, they worked around it. If he walked into a room and settled down, they called the family, no hesitation. If he ignored a patient, no matter how weak they seemed, the staff held off on final preparations. It was an unspoken rule. Oscar was never wrong, and that quiet certainty changed everything. Some nurses admitted they felt comforted by his presence. "It's like he gives people permission to pass on," one of them said, "like he's letting them know it's okay." Others couldn't shake the eerie feeling he left behind, because if Oscar sat beside you, there was no turning back. Oscar stayed at Steer House for years, comforting over 100 people in their final moments. He became famous. His story was shared around the world. And then, in 2022, after years of keeping watch over others, Oscar passed away. Linda sat beside him, just as he had done for so many others. She stroked his fur, whispering his name as his breathing grew shallow. The sunlight poured through the window, casting a warm glow across the bed. He was older now, slower, but still Oscar. Had he known this was coming? Had he waited for her the way he had waited for so many others? Linda felt his chest rise one last time beneath her hand. Then stillness. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled through them, because in the end, Oscar wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that had been his greatest wish all along. Subscribe now to our channel, where we dive into real stories from viewers and the web. Stories so unsettling they'll linger in your mind and make you see the world a little differently. Send us your story and join the growing community of mystery seekers. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore tales of the sleepless.